Welcome to the new JFK show number 94, where we are in round 4 of our response from the attack from Jim DiEugenio from Sitka over there. You want to read it yourself. We're really not afraid for people to look at it. It's a 2-part hit piece on Dr. Fetzer. So we've been calling our shows, as I put them up online, Who's a Fraud? We do have a fraud amongst us, and we want you to decide who it is. Now we've got Larry Rivera, who's just blazing trails every day in the JFK community, and he's just going to run roughshod over the whole JFK community tonight. So Dr. Fetzer, this is round 4. It looks like a TKO at any minute here, but I'm sure you're ready to keep swinging. So let's go ahead and do it, Dr. Fetzer. Round 4.
Well, it's very strange, Gary, how Jim DiEugenio has taken on so many diverse targets, because now he's approaching my work about 9/11, where to the best of my knowledge, he has never invested any time or effort in study. But here we have a quote from his critique in part 2. Larry, would you do the honor here to save my voice?
Certainly. In sum, Jones could not abide by the directed energy beams. No planes ideas of Judy Wood and Morgan Reynolds. As we have seen, Fetzer always had a penchant for the sensation solution, no matter how far out it was, no matter whom it came from. Reynolds had actually worked as an economist in the George W. Bush administration during his first term, for good reason. He was anti-labor, anti-union, and wanted to do away with the minimum wage. David Shaler was another of these wild, far-out 9/11 visionaries. Shaler stated that the Trade Center jetliner crashes were faked using missiles wrapped in holograms, quote unquote, and that, quote, there's little evidence to show that jets went into the buildings. Watch the footage frame by frame and you'll see a cigarette-shaped missile hitting the World Trade Center, unquote.
Cigar.
I'm sorry. A cigar. As Victoria Ashley wrote, Jim Fetzer is the primary force behind publicity and press releases for the claims of Judy Wood and Morgan Reynolds, advocating endless investigation into every scenario, every possible scenario imaginable. As Ashley and others properly noted, this all displays a classic example of discrediting by association.
Well, thanks for reading that, Larry. I mean, what he doesn't seem to understand is the genetic fallacy, which is judging an argument on the basis of its source. It's the generalization of the ad hominem. Here he's citing a number of ad hominem reasons, but notice he's not giving any evidence. In fact, that the plane, what we saw in New York, was not real planes. What does appear to have been images of aircraft, as I'm going to explain. So that, it's very typical of those who have never studied the evidence, that if they hear a conclusion that to them sounds far out, then they will describe it as far out, even though if you looked at the evidence, it would turn out not to be far out at all. Like the idea of Oswald in the doorway having been captured by James Ike Alchin sounds initially far out. Well, when you study the evidence, there's no doubt about it. The Zapruder film having been massively edited sounds initially far out. But when you look at the evidence, there's no doubt about it. And as I'm going to demonstrate here, the idea that holograms were used in New York sounds far out. But it turns out to be exactly what happened, as I'm going to explain. Now, on 9/11, a daughter living in Bradenton, Florida, called up and said we should turn on the paper. And I, like everyone else, was just dumbfounded by what I saw. I knew that this was not an engineering possibility. I knew something was terribly wrong. But I also said to myself, I remember thinking this so clearly, I can't imagine how I'll ever be in a position to do anything about it. Well, ironically, in December of 2005, I found myself involved in a discussion, a group conference call with a couple of dozen individuals with a lot of talent, many academicians, but also experts in other areas. And it had occurred to me it would be a good idea to found a society that could bring together experts in different areas, could have a website, sponsor conferences, post lectures and papers and all that, and founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005, inviting Stephen Jones, a professor of physics from Brigham Young University, to be my co-chair at the recommendation of David Ray Griffin, widely regarded as the dean of 9/11 studies. There was a conference in Chicago that year, and the Chronicle of Higher Education picked up on it. I actually was still on the faculty at Duluth, but by the time they published this article on June 23rd, I'd actually retired from UMD beginning that month. And this is one of the few times they feature me on their cover. Academicians, it turns out, are mostly wimps. The most they want to avoid is embarrassment. They don't want to tackle any subject that's controversial. They don't want to have a student ask a question they can't answer. So when you encounter someone like me or Kevin Barrett or others of our ilk, then they want to put us on the fringe, even if the evidence should turn out to be on our side, which is overwhelmingly proven to be the case here.
Doctor, what's the Fetzer? Dr. Fetzer, what's the problem? They don't want to invite you back to the conferences? They don't want to invite you back to the newspaper? Just too much truth, huh?
So Alex Jones organized a major conference in Los Angeles called the American Scholars Conference. And the day before, I was invited to come on to Hannity and Combs. The producer said they wanted to learn what we had discovered at Scholars. I called my wife and said, when I learned that Ole North would be sitting in for Sean, that it was going to be completely different. There's a conversation between two Marine Corps officers. And she said, don't kid yourself. They're going to try to kill you. I had a TV brought into the waiting room and heard the announcement, you're not going to believe what your students are learning from their professors. And I knew that they had given me a false story about what I was going to discuss, but I also realized they didn't know enough to get it right. And I was able to take control of that interview from the beginning. Many regard it as a classic. Check it out. You can find it online. Mm-hmm. The American Scholars Conference turned out to be a huge success. And I love participating. It was organized by Alex Jones, who invited me to give the keynote address. So it was terribly successful. We had an enormous ballroom, probably the largest group I ever lectured, with 1,200 in the audience. Perhaps even more important, C-SPAN came and covered the panel discussion on Sunday, which lasted for an hour and 45 minutes. It featured Alex Jones as moderator, but with Steve Jones, who was the physicist from BYU, Bob Bauman, who had a degree in nuclear engineering from Caltech, and who'd been the advisor to several presidents on the Star Wars project, Webster Tarpley, who was one of our nation's leading experts on covert ops and who published the book 9/11, Synthetic Terror Made in the USA, and myself as the founder of Scholars.
Was Charlie Sheen there? Was Charlie Sheen there?
Yeah, Charlie Sheen was there. It lasted an hour and 45 minutes, and then they would broadcast it multiple times. And I believe it had the effect of shattering the glass ceiling on public discussion of 9/11. Now, it would turn out that I'd be invited back onto Hannity and Combs, this time with Sean Hannity. I guess he felt Ollie hadn't been able to use me as a foil, but it didn't really quite work out that way. And I was able to use the phrase I'd introduced the first time around of Fox, of the network having their facts foxed, which I knew I had to pronounce very carefully. which made an impression and went over with the audiences who watched this. I would later that year be invited on by none other than O'Reilly, who's a very nasty guy. I was seated in a room with bright lights on my face, no sound, just an empty screen. And seconds before I went on the air, he came on and said to me, I'm going to tell the country that you tell the world that you hate your country and that you're a kook. Bing, then I'm on TV. And he's going through his first attack on me, and then he moves to a second, so you hardly have time to respond to what's going on. For a long time, I felt this had been a very unsuccessful venture because he gave me so little time to get any words in edgewise. But years later, after I'd spoken at Cooper Union for a 9/11 conference, I and my wife and a friend went to a theater where Alex Jones was conducting a conference, and they escorted me in and put me on a platform with the first responders. And when I sat down, the fellow sitting next to me leaned over and he said, it was seeing you on the factor that convinced me 9/11 was an inside job. So I felt, well, maybe it had been worth the effort after all. In December, my wife and I were flown, all expense paid, to Athens, Greece, and put on the most famous television program in the country by a muckraker who had actually exposed the corruption of several Greek governments. And I was told going in it would be 3 hours, and they had 12 panelists, but most of them never spoke. I said, not tonight. And indeed, I was right. Every one of them had comments to make. They had a whole lot of video footage set up. It was absolutely classic. They carried it over for an extra half an hour. And here's a response from a member of 9/11 Blogger who had shown up at his pizza place where he worked to discover his boss was watching this show because it was broadcast by satellite around the world. Greetings, fellow 9/11 patriots. When I arrived at my weeknight job late this Monday morning, little did I suspect that the prime theme of the evening was not going to be pizza deliveries and tips as usual. Much to my surprise, the evening was dominated by extensive discussions about what really happened on 9/11 and watching my boss and a coworker wake up quickly and dramatically to the entire 9/11 matrix. The pizzeria where I work is owned and operated by Greek immigrants. My boss has a TV in the kitchen, which is hooked up to a satellite dish. He is able to receive the Alter Globe Greek language station, which he has on much of the time. As soon as I walked in on Monday, he immediately called my attention to what was taking place live on Greek television. It was a panel discussion show involving several Greek journalists and broadcasters. They were asking questions from none other than our own Jim Fetzer, who was laying out his case point by point that 9/11 was an inside job perpetrated by elements within the U.S. government. The entire program was quite slickly produced and was supplemented by plenty of file footage. Included was an interview segment with Willie Rodriguez, a recording of Norman Minetta's testimony, and some of the sharpest, most revealing video footage of the Twin Towers demolition I've seen to date. Everything was instantly translated so the participants could understand Professor Fetzer and he could understand them. Overall, I was extremely impressed with this detailed 1-2 punch from Jim Fetzer. Certainly, it was the strongest performance I have ever witnessed from him. As can be expected, the scientific aspects were covered, but his overwhelming emphasis was on political testimony in the 9/11 timeline. One after another, the points he made were the ones that everyone in the 9/11 truth movement knows, agrees upon, dozens of them, in fact, over the course of the 3 hours. And contrary to the divisions and fear-mongering that still plagues our movement, Professor Fetzer unequivocally confirmed the findings of Dr. Stephen Jones and stated that thermite was used in the destruction of the WTC. The following year, 2007, I would organize the Madison Conference on the science and politics of 9/11. And I would publish the first book from scholars entitled The 9/11 Conspiracy, the Scamming of America, because bear in mind, even the official account involving 19 Islamic hijackers is itself a conspiracy, which only requires 2 or more individuals working together to bring about an illegal end. In 2008, I was flown to Buenos Aires to talk about both 9/11 and JFK. I gave a series of lectures, and believe it or not, in Argentina, they take intellectuals seriously, and they had my stories with photographs on the front pages of several of the newspapers in Argentina. The following year, they organized an international conference for truth and justice, for 9/11 Truth and Justice, which was held in the National Library of the Republic of Argentina. They had about 20 video cameras there, about 150 dignitaries, and they had invited me to give the keynote presentation, which I had also done, of course, in Los Angeles during the American Scholars Conference. In 2010, I organized in Friend's House, downtown London, a conference on debunking the war on terror with Ken O'Keefe, the master of ceremonies. I gave a presentation on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan justified by 9/11. Kevin Barrett, co-founder Muslims for 9/11 Truth, discussed Islam, neoconservatism, and the unwarranted war on terror. Gillett Otzman, jazz musician, political commentator, From Promised Land to Promised Planet, Zionism, and neoconservatism. In 2012, I organized the Vancouver hearings, which brought together experts on many different areas. It was utterly fascinating, very successful. And you can find it if you track down, do a search on 9/11 Vancouver hearings. You'll find everything we have. One of the principal subjects of our discussion was how the buildings were destroyed in New York City, which, as every student is aware, is among the most controversial subjects in 9/11 studies. There's a break between three different components or branches. Architects and engineers, including Richard Gage and Stephen Jones, argue that nanothermite was the key component. Judy Wood and her group claim it was directed energy weapons. Scholars and our associates maintain it was done with a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes. I'll say more about that. I would emphasize that I and a chemical engineer, T. Mark Hightower, published 3 articles demonstrating that nanothermite doesn't possess the explosive capability to have blown apart the towers. And Judy Wood has been incredibly vague. But this will give you kind of an idea about how a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes might have worked. The simple model I often use, which varies from the details of this diagram, would be, these nukes have dialable radius. You could set the radius at 100 feet, so it'd be 200 feet in diameter, direct them upwards on the core columns. And if you took out 1 cube of 10 floors per second, then in the North Tower, which had 110 floors, you could take out 1 cube of 10 floors per second for 11 seconds. The South Tower, the top 3 cubes had tilted to the side and were taken out as 1/9, which happens to correspond with the time estimates from the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Those buildings, by the way, were both blown to ground level or even below. It's a fascinating subject about which I have published a great deal. The BBC would come to my home and interview me for 8 hours about 9/11. This was from their first interview. They would eventually return and interview me for 4 more hours for a second. This was for their Conspiracy Files first program on 9/11. Of that 8 hours, during which I presented dozens and dozens and dozens of arguments about how we knew the government had not told us what had happened on 9/11. They selected from all that 4.5 minutes, which had to do with a point I made about the debris showing up on the Pentagon lawn, having been dropped by a C-130, 3.5 minutes of Alex Jones, and then another several minutes of Dylan Avery. So it was 50 minutes between the 3 of us at all, where Dylan was supposed to be the snot-nosed college kid, Alex the messianic preacher, and I the kooky professor. The rest of it was loaded, by the way, with psychobabble about why anyone would believe these things, not documenting the evidence. But it put me in the position to expose the charade, so that I published a piece which I regard as extremely revealing about how the media misrepresents what we know about 9/11. This, entitled "The BBC's Instrument of 9/11 Misinformation," was their conspiracy file series, which you can find online. And of course, subsequently, this was 2012, I'd be interviewed by the Iran Review, and he explained the crucial role of the Mossad, where 9/11 was brought to us by the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense, most of whom were dual U.S. citizens, dual U.S.-Israeli citizens, and the Mossad, where experts have agreed that the only two agencies in the world capable of pulling it off were the CIA and the Mossad. And on 9/11, they were working together. I've dealt with many of these issues in other contexts, for example, about the science of how the buildings were destroyed and the planes, the faking of the various plane sites during the Midwest 9/11 Truth Conference, Part 2, where during Part 1, we played explosive evidence from architects and engineers, which does a good job of demonstrating that the government has not explained to us what happened to the Twin Towers. But I explained the inadequacies of nanothermite and why it requires going much further. More recently, I gave false flag attacks from 9/11 to Sandy Hook and beyond, already on February 21st and February 20th. And I'm very pleased that Paul Craig Roberts, for example, actually is linked to these presentations in the article he's now published, asking whether or not we live in a constructed or fabricated society where we're simply presented with false accounts of events in order to manipulate us for that purpose. Now, before turning to the planes in New York on 9/11, I wanted to review that history just to give you some idea of how much there was to choose between, how many contributions I've made, multiple conferences, international, in Canada, in London, flown to Athens, flown to Buenos Aires. But Jim DiEugenio, and this obviously is by design, wants to pick on the most controversial issue about what happened in New York. And while I welcome addressing it, I simply point out that this is special pleading in his ongoing effort to make a case against me. Because if you look at all the evidence, I have been making so many contributions across such a wide range of issues related to 9/11. That's very difficult to appreciate them in any comprehensive way without devoting a whole lot more time and effort than he was willing to invest, because, of course, it didn't suit his purpose. Victoria Ashley, for example, is notorious to be a disinformation purveyor. She attacks all serious research on 9/11. No one who takes her seriously understands what's going on. But then it's easy to see that that's the case with Jim DiEugenio. Now, let me use Flight 175 as an illustration here. There's some 52 videos that show the plane approaching the building from one perspective or another. Pilots for 9/11 Truth analyzed the speed of the plane in these videos and discovered that it was traveling faster than possible for a Boeing 767 at 700 to 1,000 feet altitude. Now, altitude is extremely important here because they were attributing to the plane a speed that it could acquire. It was even approximately its cruising speed at 35,000 feet. But at 35,000 feet, the air is only 1/3 as dense as it is at 700 to 1,000 feet, because of which, as John Lear, for example, explains, the turbines cannot suck the air through the engines fast enough, and they begin functioning as brakes. which means that the video we're looking at portrays a Boeing 767 traveling faster than aerodynamically possible. Now, this is not my conclusion. This comes from pilots for 9/11 Truth, who have done a lot of extremely important work in this area. Now, if you look at those videos, you see the plane simply effortlessly disappears into the building. It's been variously referred to as a ghost plane because its entry is ghostly, or a butter plane, as though we're entering an enormous cube of butter. But the key point is well seen here, namely that there's no collision effects. There's no damage to the building, no damage to the plane, suggesting that something highly untoward, that isn't even physically possible, is taking place here. And indeed, in the case of Flight 175, it's intersecting with 8 different floors, each of which consists of a steel truss connected to the core columns at one end and to the external steel support columns at the other, where even those external steel support columns were already quite massive, where each of those trusses was filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. The variance because they had V-shaped grooves that were 4 inches deep. So in some locations it would be 4 inches thick, and others 8. But because the buildings were 208 feet on a side, what this means is each of those floors represented an acre of concrete on a steel truss. Now, the claim has been made that the plane entered the building effortlessly because the windows were large. But that's simply not the case. The windows were deliberately designed to be small so that the building wouldn't heat up excessively and overwhelm the air conditioning system. So you can see here, it simply falls. I mean, I have calculated that maybe 25% of the facade of one of these buildings would be glass. That would mean if you take those to be easy access for parts of a plane, you could argue 25% of the plane could enter by way of the glass, but the rest of it would not. And yet, look what we have here. This is a nice photo sequence by Jack White, legendary photo and film analyst from JFK, with whom I collaborated on 9/11 research as well. We have done frame by frame advance with both the Hezer Connie, taken from the side video, and the Evan Fairbanks, which you see here, taken straight up. And the plane passes through its entire length into the building in the same number of frames. It passes through its entire length in air. Which, of course, is a physical absurdity unless a massive 500,000-ton building provides no more resistance to the trajectory of an aircraft in flight than air.
Yeah.
We have here a diagram by a student of 9/11 of what should have happened. The plane should have crumpled up against the side of the building. Body, seats, luggage, wings, tail fall into the ground. The engines could have entered the building, but most not. This comes from Ace Baker. And here, what actually happened was the planes entered all of the buildings before they exploded. I think that was the problem. The original plan had been to use drones and to fly them into the building and to ensure they only exploded after they were all the way inside the building. But it wasn't physically possible to do that. Indeed, there are multiple reasons why they had to fake it, one of which is it's very difficult to hit a building that's only 208 feet wide. Pilots for 9/11 Truth, for example, originally took simulators to attempt to do it. 1 in 20 could accomplish it. Now, that could have been overcome by having a sensor to guide the plane located in each of the buildings. But the fact is, even with a sensor to guide the plane, it could not have made the entry because it was physically impossible to overcome the massive horizontal resistance created by the 8 floors filled with concrete in the case of the South Tower, or the 7 filled with concrete in the case of the North. So since they had to get the plane inside, and the tremendous friction that would have been generated by the collision of one of these planes with the exterior would almost certainly have caused it to explode already outside of the building, they had to fake it. They had pre-positioned explosives to go off to simulate a fireball inside of the building. And indeed, if we look beneath the facades of the North and the South Tower, you find there's no aircraft debris. There's no wings, no bodies, no seats, no luggage, no tails. You could have reclined in a lounge chair sipping Mai Tais and been perfectly safe beneath those facades of the North and the South Tower on 9/11. Now, Jack White discovered that an engine component that was found at Church and Murray had been planted there. If you look in the upper left photographs, he discovered there was a set of 5 or 6 agents wearing FBI vests unloading something heavy. They put it on the street beneath a steel scaffolding, but they made several mistakes. A massive object like that would have done tremendous damage to the sidewalk had it hit the sidewalk at high speed. It turns out to be the wrong engine. It's from an antiquated engine. There's an air rotator at the very top that's been carefully studied. This was not an engine that was in use with Boeing 767 on 2001. And notice in the foreground, they even left behind a dolly.
And that's amazing that they left a dolly there for all to see. It's just
dumb things were done, Gary, and that's part of why we've been able to expose it. These were not rocket scientists. Now, there was 2 sets of seismic blasts in relation to the Twin Towers. There were very modest blasts, 0.7 and 0.9 on the Richter scale, that occurred sometime before the more massive blasts at 2.1 and 2.3 on the Richter scale. And these occurred in the sub-basements of the North Tower and the South Tower. You can see smoke here coming up in this instance from the North Tower from one of those blasts. It did damage to the lobbies, for example. William Rodriguez, who was the senior custodian in the North Tower, reported this massive blast, and how a number of his co-workers were injured. One showed up with the flesh just hanging off of his body. Now, it turns out that they were going to attempt to coordinate those blasts with the impact of the planes and claim that jet fuel had fallen through the elevator shafts and exploded in the sub-basements to have an explanation. But as Gordon Ross and Craig Furlong discovered, they were off on their time. The blasts went off too early, or the plane strikes too late, where there's a 14 and 17 second difference in each case, which they have studied repeatedly. You can find addressed in their article, Seismic Proof, 9/11 was an inside job. Now, as a student of Chuck Baldwin, who's a retired high school physics, math, and chemistry teacher, has observed, the design of the building made it virtually impossible to collapse. Look at the diagram on the left. The steel at the bottom was 6 inches thick, 5, 4, and so forth, tapering up to the top, where it was only a 1/4 inch. What that means is, for example, the top 14 floors of the North Tower, which were alleged to have collapsed and brought about the destruction of the rest of the building, only represent 1.4% of the mass of the steel. The idea that 1.4% of the mass of the steel could have brought about the collapse of the lower 98.4% is simply absurd. Indeed, David Skilling, who was on the engineering firm that designed the building, observed that they'd been built with a safety factor of 20, meaning every floor could carry 20 times its expected live load. Well, the live load is the empty floors plus the personnel the desks, the computers, and everything else that would turn it into a live load. The collapse of these buildings wasn't even a physical impossibility. Now, here's a diagram from the side giving you an idea about the elevator shafts. It was very tricky because they were actually designed as 3 30-story buildings. So you'd have to come down 30 floors, get off, go to another set of elevators, get off, go down another set of elevators. There were only a couple of shafts that ran all the way from the top to the bottom. So the idea of jet fuel falling all the way through to cause those collisions was a dubious proposition to begin with. But they anticipated the American public would be oblivious, who would even notice. And by and large, they have been correct, because but for a handful of dedicated students of 9/11, very few members, even inside the 9/11 community, understand the points that I'm making as I speak with you right now. So how was it done? Well, there's a fellow in the UK by the name of Richard D. Hall who studied the 52 videos and discovered like 27 of them were sufficiently precise and specific to put together locations and times of the plane approaching the buildings. He discovered belatedly that NIST had a similar set of positions and times, but that NIST claimed it was based upon radar data, which did not look correct to him. He investigated and discovered there was 9/11 radar data, but it was for a plane that was like 1,400 feet to the right, which you see in the trajectory on the right, approaching the building. And that radar data showed a plane passing right beside the towers. It appears projecting an image as it passed by, which is why it so effortlessly entered the building. I've subsequently discovered an airborne holographic projector from a military manual, which you see here. The holographic projector displays a 3-dimensional visual image in a desired location removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. It's also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary, which would include the citizens of New York, who, hearing the sound of the plane projecting the image, mistook it for the sound of the image projected. And as you can see at the bottom, it had the effect that the radar didn't pick up the projected image, but only the plane doing the projection, which explains why we have the impossible impact physics with no effects of collision, and even the impossible speed of the plane, because they had to fly faster than would have been aerodynamically possible for a Boeing 767 in order to preserve the integrity of the holographic image. Now get this, I mentioned pilots having done such brilliant work. Well, here, based upon their study of air-ground communication system known as ACARS, they were able to establish not only that Flight 93 was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had allegedly crashed in Shanksville, but that Flight 175, reported here, was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, long after it had reportedly hit the South Tower. And I obtained Federal Aviation Administration registration records, which showed that the plane that was used for United 175, the South Tower, and the plane that was used for United 93 in Pennsylvania were both deregistered or formally taken out of service only on 29 September 2005, which, when you put together with the fact of evidence that flights 11, North Tower, and 77, the Pentagon, were not even in the air that day, raise the following questions. How can planes that weren't in the air have crashed on 9/11? And how can planes that crashed on 9/11 have still been in the air 4 years later? Most Americans have a hard time putting together that a half a dozen or more of these so-called suicide hijackers turned up alive and well and were interviewed by the British media the day after 9/11, which David Ray Griffin makes the first point of his magisterial work, the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, which means that none of these planes crashed on 9/11, which means that none of the passengers aboard those planes died in crashes that did not take place, which means that none of the suicide hijackers brought about the crash of planes that did not take place. I have discussed all of this in greater detail elsewhere, including here on The Real Deal in episode 100, 9/11, the crash sites, where I go through all four of the crash sites with Major General Albert Stubblebine, U.S. Army retired, who was formerly in charge of all U.S. military signals and photographic intelligence, and then about who was responsible and why in The Real Deal episode 103 with Dennis Camino, who was the Navy's top electronics troubleshooter until he left the Navy and went to work for Raytheon, where we discuss all of the evidence that substantiates that 9/11 was brought to us by the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. Before I turn to the next topic, do either of you, Larry or Gary, have a question about any of what I've just covered?
Well, I just wanted to ask you about when you were on Fox News, you were on Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, and what was the other one?
It's Hannity and Combs twice. It's just that Ollie North was sitting in for Sean the first time.
Right.
So how many times have you been set up, Dr. Fetzer?
Well, it backfired on him, Gary. Go and watch any of these. I've had lots of very positive response, simply overwhelming, because they didn't know enough to get it right. For example, they brought me into the first interview in the belief that I was teaching a course about 9/11. That was untrue. I had no such course. Now, I talked about 9/11 a lot as examples in courses on critical thinking, for example, but I had no such course. So whereas they thought they were going to impale me by having a required course on 9/11, I was able to take the control of the program away from them and explain they had their facts foxed and that there was no such course. I knew of no such course, but that it was an excellent idea because there was so much information out there available for such a course to be taught. So
I remember you said, you've got your facts all foxed up.
I just said they had.
So,
hello.
Right,
facts fox, Gary. I thought that was just right.
I just want to comment that not only have the pilots been truth seekers for 9/11, but also the architects and engineers with their website ae911truth.org, and I've looked at that website and it's just fascinating. I also wanted to mention that you have done some shows with Mr. Weisbacher on precisely the penetration of the supposed penetration of the jets into the towers, and the images that he's been able to put together are just very, very compelling, which prove that there were no jets flying into the Twin Towers the way that we've been led to believe all these years.
Well, there are three major groups in 9/11. Architects and engineers led by Richard Gage and Stephen Jones, the Do group led by Judy Wood, and then the Scholars group, which I lead, where we, and Don has been a very active contributor here, have been able to establish that the buildings were blown apart by a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes. Some of the most important evidence supporting that, ironically, comes from dust sample studies conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey, which found a whole host of elements that would not have been present had this not been a nuclear event, including barium and strontium, uranium, lithium, lanthanum, tritium. And it's therefore fascinating to me that architects and engineers won't go there because their position that it was done using nanothermite, which is an incendiary that generates high temperatures and brilliant light, but lacks the rapid gas expansion properties that characterize explosions, cannot have performed the work that was involved in blowing these buildings apart, and where the inspiration for nanothermite came from a very limited dust samples collected from an apartment of a woman near ground zero. In addition, Judy Wood has her book, Where Did the Towers Go?, which I reviewed before the Vancouver hearings and gave it initially a 5-star review. But because she brings together so much evidence in one place, it's a massive compilation. But I suggested that it was flawed insofar as it ruled out the use of large-scale nukes, but not mini or micro nukes. Would you believe? I put that up in May before the Vancouver hearings in June, and by the time I'd returned from the hearings, my review had been attacked over 3,000 times by followers of Judy Wood, who regard it essentially as a sacred text where Judy is their mystical leader, and they'll brook no criticism, no matter how mild. So that because we had adduced so much more evidence that it was done with mini or micro nukes, I revised the review and downgraded it to a 3-star review and added a list of the elements whose presence have been discovered by the U.S. Geological Survey, where their quantity and correlation was overwhelming proof that this had been a nuclear event. Now, Judy Wood, who has a background as an engineer, has shown a highly unscientific attitude here because she won't acknowledge the evidence or take it into account. It requires revising her views.
Well,
and it's equally ironic that architects and engineers, which has been inspired by the study of dust samples, has, to my knowledge, never acknowledged the importance of the overwhelmingly more sophisticated, more varied and comprehensive dust sample studies done by the U.S. Geological Survey. And here, and in some ways even more important than their failure to address the issue how it was done, is that neither of those organizations will talk about who was responsible and why. Neither architects and engineers claim it's part of their charter that they're restricted to talk about how it was done. But I think any of those Americans who've donated so generously to architects and engineers would be very surprised to learn that architects and engineers regard the question of who was responsible and why as out of bounds. Judy Wood is, if anything, even worse, because she goes on at great length about how we have to know exactly how it was done in every minute detail before we can address the question of who was responsible and why, which means that, notwithstanding your points, Larry, about the good work done by architects and engineers in informing the public that the official account of the government cannot possibly be correct, I regard both A&E 9/11 and Judy Wood and her do group as limited hangouts, because they won't go far enough to address the most important questions. They give a partial answer to how it was done, but not a good one. And they completely fail to address who was responsible and why, which is the reason I so strongly recommend reviewing the Real Deal episode 100 with Major General Albert Stubblebine, who was formerly in charge of all U.S. signals and photographic intelligence, who agrees with me, by the way, that all 4 of the crash sites were fabricated or faked, albeit in different ways, which means that none of those planes crashed on 9/11, which means none of the passengers aboard those planes died in crashes that did not occur, which means there were no suicide hijackers aboard those planes that caused them to crash, which means the entire war on terror is predicated upon a false premise, and where we simply have to go where the evidence leads. As in the case of JFK, we are committed to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I am precisely of the same disposition in relation to 9/11. I am dedicated to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And to me, it's a very troubling situation, because architects and engineers, by virtue of their membership of professional architects and engineers, has captivated the public's attention. And I think there would be general dismay if they understood that by design, by the dedication of their own charter, they will not address who was responsible and why.
Well, you can start by wondering why there were so few, if not no, Jewish people who died in the attacks of 9/11. And also the story of the dancing Israelis that I wanted to mention. And also, what about Building 7? Was that also subject to many nukes, or was that building just brought down by conventional demolition operation? Especially, we know that that reporter that was reporting, I believe for the British television, she was reporting that the building had come down when it still had not been demolished. It demolished immediately after she had made that statement, which I thought was very, very strange.
Yes. I cover all this in those two episodes I mentioned, but let me be specific about it. Architects and engineers have been very good in emphasizing that Building 7 was brought down as a classic controlled demolition. It wasn't hit by any plane. It suffered no jet fuel-based fires, where NIST, may I observe, studied 236 samples of steel selected from the Twin Towers and discovered 233 had not been exposed to temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature of an ordinary office fire. The other three not above 1,200 were under Ryder's laboratory and certified the steel used in the building to 2,000 degrees for 3 to 4 hours without suffering any adverse effects, either weakening, much less melting. And where the fire in the South Tower only endured about an hour, in the North about an hour and a half. So these fires burned neither long enough nor hot enough to cause the steel to weaken, much less melt. In fact, the intricate lattice structure made them a massive heat sink. So it had been extraordinarily difficult to try to heat up any particular portion of the steel, because it would have been distributed throughout the entire structure. So the whole idea that the intense heat, which was not even present after the first 15 or 20 seconds of those fireballs consuming what had been previously positioned, were actually very modest fires. That's why they had to take out, with those explosions in the sub-basement, they had to drain the sprinkler systems of water. It was when Willie came here to Madison and we had dinner together, and he began describing watching the sub-basements fill up with water, that I realized the reason they had to conduct those explosions in the sub-basements were to drain the sprinkler systems of water, since otherwise they would have extinguished the very modest fires that remained, and there would have been no pseudo-explanation to account for the collapse of the buildings. Jesse Ventura, who showed a gift for making complex points in a simple way, has observed that his camping stove is also made out of steel, burns propane at a higher temperature than kerosene, which is the constituent of jet fuel, and yet it does not melt when he takes it out on a camping trip. Now, in relation to Building 7, yes, you made the impeccable point that Jane Stanley of the BBC announced that the Solomon Brothers building, which was another name for Building 7, had collapsed at 4:57 when it would not take place until 5:20. So she was 23 minutes early, and you can see the building still standing over her shoulder. Remarkably, we have eyewitness reports from inside the building that morning because Barry Jennings, who was an official with the New York Emergency Management System, was inside the building. He'd gone to Rudy Giuliani's command and control structure there in Building 7, which had an own air and water supply. He discovered still steaming cups of coffee, half-eaten sandwiches. A fireman came along and said, "We got to get you out of here." As he escorted him out, explosions were taking place. A stairwell was blown out from under him. At one point, he felt himself stepping over dead bodies. In the pitch blackness, he couldn't see them, but he could feel them. And when he got out, he gave several interviews, which you can still find online, about his experiences where they were prepping the building for its destruction. That was an extraordinarily robust building. I believe it may have been the most ever designed by the hand of man. It was erected over 2 enormous electrical generators providing electricity for lower Manhattan. It was designed to never collapse. Just to offer one illustration, even in the Twin Towers, the most solid beams were hollowed out in the center because they give virtually as much support as solid steel beams. But in Building 7, they use solid steel beams. There's no mention of Building 7 in the 9/11 Commission report. And when NIST finally got around to preparing its study, just days before Barry Jennings died unexpectedly, so that he would not be available to contradict the official report of Building 7 based upon his own experience in the building that morning. I'm sorry to say he's not the only person who appears to have been a key witness to events that the government would prefer they had not seen, who managed to disappear as a witness and to die an unexpected death. Other comments, Larry, Gary?
Yeah, what about foreknowledge of the attacks, especially by some members of the Jewish community?
Oh, yeah, I go into it extensively, Larry. Look at episode 103 with Dennis Camino, who was responsible and why. A Jewish security firm was running the airports where the flights originated. There was a Jewish messaging service that was notifying people. Even a little old lady from Brooklyn called me to tell me that their rabbi had warned the members of her synagogue not to go into Lower Manhattan that day. There's a tremendous amount of evidence substantiating the complicity between the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense and the Mossad, which you can find in episode 103. Gary, thanks very much for this opportunity to respond to Jim DiEugenio about the use of holograms. Once again, if only he had done enough research, he would have realized that, just as in so many other cases, before you study the evidence, what initially looks to be a far-out proposition turns out to be actually the only viable explanation of what happened.
All right. You've been listening to the new 9/11 show with Dr. Fetzer, Larry Rivera, and Chance George in the editor's chair. We'll be back for round 5 next week.